Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. Today I'm going to have a little chat about Shakespeare adaptations. Now, I'm not a Shakespeare expert or anything. I prefer his hits. I do think out of his 37 plays, he does repeat himself a lot. With the themes of corruption and power and love and evil, as most creative people do, tend to repeat themselves once they get into themes. I am drawn to Shakespeare because of his one-liners. Some of his one-liners are just fantastic. There's so much language in his phrases that are in regular use that we use all the time that were derived from Shakespeare. I mean, sometimes there's two camps, people who prefer, the full-blown Shakespeare experience of every single word should be in an adaptation. Other people prefer kind of abridged versions of plays, people adapting them to the current period, updating them to modern day. I kind of like a bit of both, but if I'm being honest, I kind of prefer adaptations or abridged versions of the plays. Obviously, I'm just an amateur. I'm not a hardcore Shakespeare fan. And some of my favourite ones are only kind of inspired by Shakespeare plays rather than kind of word for word versions. So I'm just going to show you the ones that I have in my collection. Obviously I don't have a huge amount of Shakespeare things. There will be obvious omissions to people, like Polanski's Macbeth I don't have, for example. But again, you can let me know in the comments what your favourite film Shakespeare adaptations are, or which ones you would recommend that I pick up that I don't have. I'm not going to include Forbidden Planet in this list, even though it's kind of The Tempest, but it's not really blatantly known as The Tempest as far as when they were making it or anything like that. Because again, I could put Kurosawa's Bad Sleep Well, because that's got a little bit of Hamlet in it, but I'm not going to do things that are not clearly kind of a Shakespeare adaptation. I'll just start with a couple that I do have in DVD, but I just haven't dug them out because I've just got them in disc only, and that's Al Pacino's documentary Looking for Richard, which I actually saw in the cinema, bizarrely, back when I used to go to the cinema. It's an interesting little film. Pacino kind of does parts of the play in costume, and part of the film is him talking to Shakespearean actors about, can Americans do Shakespeare properly, or things like that. It's an interesting little film, and Pacino actually does a pretty good turn as Richard III. The other one is Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet, which is obviously the full play, so it's like 4 hours or something like that. To be honest, I think I've only watched it once. Again, it's lavish, it looks good, but to me, doing the full thing is a bit much, but again, that's just my preference. You can let me know in the comments below if Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet is your favourite adaptation. So I'm going to start, you might as well start with Laurence Olivier This is a 7-disc DVD set, which I only got for £7, which I thought was a pretty good deal. Because they are all on individual DVDs, they're not actually all compressed on 2 DVDs. So you get Henry V, which to my shame I still haven't watched, his Hamlet, King Lear when he was older, Merchant of Venice, Richard III, and As You Like It. So I've only seen Hamlet. Again, I'm not really a huge fan of the Laurence Olivier Shakespeare stuff. I think it is too theatrical and not cinematic enough. But again, I probably need to rewatch Hamlet and Richard III and watch the other 4. And there's also a disc of Michael Parkinson interviews with Laurence Olivier. Next is arguably my favourite Shakespeare film, even though it's not really a Shakespeare film, even though it is. And that's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, the only film that Tom Stoppard ever directed, based on his play, which focuses on Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are the 2 side characters in Hamlet. They are Hamlet's school days friends, and they get sequestered by the new king to find out what is troubling Hamlet. But in Stoppard's version, the story is with them. It's just an absolute joy. The script is wonderful. Gary Oldman and Tim Roth have great chemistry. Richard Dreyfuss turns up as the leader of the players. I think Charlton Heston plays that character in Kenneth Branagh's version. And the action of Hamlet just kind of passes them by. It kind of involves them briefly and then it goes away and they're just left bewildered. And they're just as confused as perhaps the audience about what is troubling Hamlet. Ian Glenn gives a really fey and kind of ethereal performance as Hamlet. And then you have these kind of 2 buffoons who don't really know what's going on. Tim Roth is kind of the serious one who thinks he knows what's going on. Gary Oldman is the kind of goofy one who is secretly doing all these physics experiments. Like he notices the water level goes up and down when he gets up and down out of the bath. He kind of accidentally discovers steam power and a burger. It's kind of bizarre little side bits, while the drama of Hamlet is going on round about them. It has a really interesting little score to it, and obviously it has the spoiler alert, the wonderfully bleak Hamlet ending. They are kind of in other places while characters from Hamlet are doing their famous speeches on the other side of the wall and things like that. If you haven't seen it, it's a lovely little gem from 1990. It's a perfect example of kind of incorporating Shakespeare, but kind of doing your own thing. It would have been fascinating to get a time machine and see what Shakespeare actually thinks of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Obviously there's a running joke of which one's Guildenstern and which one's Rosencrantz. It's a film that I've loved ever since I saw it in the early 90s. Next, it's part of the box set by Aki Kaurismäki, and it's Hamlet Goes Business from 1987, I believe. I did a video on it as I'm doing a Kaurismäki series. It's a wonderfully offbeat, off-the-wall version of Hamlet, and it has some spectacularly funny deaths, unlike the Shakespeare play, which just has brutal deaths in it. So that's one well worth checking out if you're looking for a little bit of a offbeat adaptation. Next is Derek Jarman's Angelic Conversation, which isn't a straight adaptation of a Shakespeare play, but it features 14 of Shakespeare's sonnets, and they are read by Judi Dench before she was a dame. And the soundtrack is by Coil, which I love the soundtrack. And it's Derek Jarman, it's experimental, it's kind of dreamlike, trance-like, and it's quite an experience. I would recommend the BFI DVD. I did a random review of that a while ago as well, if you want to go check that out. But there's just something quite moving and ethereal and trance-like about it. Next is the two Kurosawa loose adaptations. That's Ran, which is a loose adaptation of King Lear. Obviously substitutes the three daughters for three sons, about a king going mad, and the family feud. It could actually have been called Family Feud. Ran kind of roughly means chaos, and obviously it's Kurosawa's late career masterpiece, which is a visual feast for the eye and the mind, and arguably Kurosawa's bleakest film, despite all the vivid colours. Next is Throne of Blood, his kind of adaptation of Macbeth, with Mifune going full, some people might say he goes too far, but again, Kurosawa's shot composition, the wonderful finale of Birnam Wood, or Birnam Wood coming to the castle, or Cobweb Castle in this case. Use of nature, weather, trees and wind and dirt, fog. It's just a sensational film, and arguably my favourite Shakespeare film, or rough Shakespeare film. Next are a couple of examples of setting films kind of more up to date. So this is Richard III by Richard Loncraine, starring Ian McKellen. Again, this is kind of set in the 40s, and almost like in an alternate universe, obviously inspired by the Third Reich. Again, this is an adaptation, it's not word for word, there's tanks instead of horses. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work, but it's driven by an amazing performance by Ian McKellen. Again, some of the supporting cast, obviously people like Nigel Hawthorne, for example, are obviously wonderful because they've trained in Shakespeare. But people like Annette Bening and Robert Downey Jr. perhaps are a little bit out of place, but it moves at a really good clip. Again, I always give people credit for updating Shakespeare or trying to put it in another setting that we're not used to, rather than just doing a stagey, theatrical, kind of word for word adaptation. Again, you might disagree, you can let me know in the comments which you prefer, like I said. The next one is Coriolenus, directed by Ray Fiennes, from 2011. This one's interesting because Ray Fiennes played Coriolanus on the stage about 10 years before he made the film, and he was always wanted to make the film. Gerard Butler's apparently his first acting job was in Coriolanus for Stephen Berkoff, who we'll get to later, just as an ensemble member of the cast. So that's how ties those two people in it. Vanessa Redgrave is in it as Coriolanus' mother, who's fantastic. Brian Cox is in it, who's always good. But again, some of the casting choices are a little bit ropey. Jessica Chastain, who seems to be the male Michael Fassbender, because she seems to be in every third film made, isn't great, but to be fair, she doesn't have that much to do. And Gerard Butler, is channeling 300. At times he's effective, and at other times he's a bit hammy. Ray Fiennes, again, very much like Ian McKellen and Richard III, really drives the film. He's got a fantastic stare on him in this film. Again, it's a cut down version. I wasn't familiar with Coriolenus, but Fiennes did say it's a fairly dense play, so the kind of job of cutting it down was an interesting one. He still wanted to keep obviously some wonderful speeches. Again, it's got great one-liners in it. Shakespeare could have been a stand-up comic. Overall, it's a worthy attempt, again, at updating it, making it more modern. It's set in a city called Rome. It's not supposed to be Rome itself. It's just the mindset of a city called Rome. Yeah, well worth checking out. Again, it's perhaps a little long at just over 2 hours, but for Vanessa Redgrave and Ray Fiennes, it's probably worth picking up just to see that. Next we have 3 Orson Welles films. Othello on Criterion, which has the 1952 version of 93 minutes and the 1955 version of 91 minutes. I mean, you could make the argument that Orson Welles' Shakespeare films are his best films. It's an argument you could make. Again, shot over a period of years, low budget, should be an absolute mess, but Welles' sheer just skills as a genius filmmaker shine through. It's easily the best version of Othello that I've seen. Not that I've seen a huge amount of versions of Othello, but it's just a stunning film, beautiful, and now that it's properly restored, it kind of hangs together so much better. Again, it's almost like a film noir, pardon the pun. Next, it's Chimes at Midnight, again on Criterion Blu-ray. For years, this was one of those ones that you couldn't really see that easily, from 1966. Certainly his last great film, probably. This is kind of a mix of a few bits of Shakespeare, just like Falstaff's armour. It takes a bit from a few. It's Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, Richard II, Henry V, and the Merry Wives of Windsor, and he just kind of puts them all together. John Gielgud turns up for a day's shooting and is absolutely amazing, as you'd expect. It's perhaps Orson Welles' best acting performance of his career. You really feel for Falstaff at the end. It's got an absolutely heartbreaking ending. It's got one of the best battle scenes in cinema history, and again, Orson Welles being Orson Welles. Again, that was kind of shot in an afternoon in a park in the middle of a city, but it's just shot so well, you really get an idea of the dirt and the devastation and the brutality of war. It's an amazing film. A bit rough around the edges, but again, that's what the character of Falstaff is. And it's just more Orson Welles genius. And then we have Orson Welles' Macbeth, which is an olive Blu-ray. And again, this has 2 cuts. It has the 1948 107-minute version, and it has the 1950 85-minute version. Again, both have different kind of language cuts, if you like. One's a little bit more Scottish accents. But again, this was shot, I think, over 23 days or something like that. And again, you can tell it's kind of sets, it's cheapness, but for some reason that just adds to the atmosphere of the thing. And again, it's just absolutely wonderful. Again, Wells uses mist, and again, it's another great performance by him, and a great performance by Jeanette Nolan. I almost forgot her name. Who plays Lady Macbeth. And again, it's just Orson Welles showing off, basically. Next is the 2015 Macbeth, with Marion Cotillard and the aforementioned Michael Fassbender. This is an absolutely beautiful film. It's shot ravishingly well. Again, this is just another excuse to show off a plain archive. But the cinematography is absolutely stunning in it. Fassbender actually makes a very good Macbeth. Again, it's a kind of pared down adaptation, but it really gets... Because a lot of Shakespeare kind of forgets about the time they were set in, and this one really gives you a good idea of the filth of the time in Scotland, and the squalor, and the fact that Fassbender does not look well. He's very thin and haggard. You know, there's no McDonald's. Well, the restaurants anyway at that point, in Scotland. Is it perfect? No, but they really go with Scottish accents, which might be jarring to some people. You might have to put the subtitles on. But it's a stunning film visually, and it, you know, Macbeth does have arguably my favourite Shakespeare line at the moment, which is "Things without remedy should be without regard." Fassbender's really good. It looks absolutely beautiful. If you haven't seen it, I would check it out. And finally, I have Stephen Berkoff present Shakespeare's Heroes and Villains. This is a fun release. I think it was made for television initially. I don't think it was ever in the cinema or anything. It's about 83 minutes, and it's Berkoff just talking about Shakespeare and talking about several speeches in Heroes and Villains. So he does Oberon, he does Coriolenus, he doesn't do Hamlet, he does Richard III, Henry V. He has a nice epilogue and prologue using Henry V. He talks about the theatre and how, you know, we don't have as many the Shakespearean actors left who then become directors to pass on their knowledge to. He kind of takes shots at Hollywood casting. He takes shots at modern theatre directors. He talks about the importance of the audience's imagination. You know, the opening of Henry V is essentially Shakespeare saying, you know, use your imagination. I'm giving you the words, but you actually have to use your imagination to paint these pictures. It's really funny. Obviously, Berkoff can sometimes be a little bit full of himself and a little bit up to 11, but it's a really charming little piece. He is funny. He gives really nice readings, especially there's a wonderful bit where he plays Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. It's a lot of fun. You can pick it up really cheaply. Obviously, if you don't like Stephen Berkoff, it's probably not the best one to pick up, but a lot of fun. And actually, there's some insight into the characters. There's some nice insight into Macbeth, because I didn't actually realise there's a bit where Lady Macbeth talks to the three witches and is pretty much saying, strip me of all my womanhood and femaleness. So she essentially becomes the male figure, and Macbeth, who at that point is confused and doesn't know what to do, it's almost as if he becomes the female figure in the play. So that was an interesting little insight that had went over my head, no matter the number of times I've seen Macbeth adaptations. So it's well worth checking out if you're interested in that kind of thing. So again, I don't have a bunch of Shakespeare. I'm not like a super Shakespeare fan or anything. So apologies if I've offended you if you're a super Shakespeare fan. But let me know in the comments below what your favourite film adaptation is, and what are the glaring omissions in my collection, what ones you would recommend that I don't have. So thanks very much for watching this episode of In the Frame. Hopefully you'll join me again for more episodes of In the Frame. And with that bombshell, I shall say farewell. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films.